geez, and other snails. Whew. Okay. They're just snails. Making all the rocks slippery, though, I'll tell you how much. Alright, come on. Gonna have to kill a few snails to make snail aid. Okay. Made it. Snail. Didn't want to kill you, but I had to. Sharpen your knife. Oh, the wind's taking my camera. God exists. And the big question is, who is God? Well, as we've already discussed, the existence God probabilistically is certain. We can be certain, based on all of the evidence, that there is such an extremely high probability that God exists, based on all the facts and evidence and scientists, as detailed in my previous video. We know that something fills that seat of authority as creator of the universe. Everything around us demands it to the fullest extent that even those who deny the existence of a divine deity still admit the necessity of something creative, which evolutionists call natural selection. Natural selection is creating something that goes in a direction. Natural selection is selecting nature's preference. Now, that means that literally every single culture and person admits that something is being created. No one denies in creation. We just deny the divine creator or the non-divine creator. And that's where I'm here to answer and nail down. So, how do we know what created? Well, let's make it a probabilistic assumption here, right? Let's say throughout all of time in history, majority belief system, through all cultures, no matter where you go, have an instinct to establish a God. There is not an instinct to establish a non-God, but a God. Theism is the natural selective process. Atheists have to admit this, and they say that it is a natural byproduct of the evolutionary process, but they admit it's there. So we're all in agreement that there is a creative process in action. There is something that is creating, whether you call it natural selection or a divine deity. And now we need to choose between the two. So we're going to go for divine deity and see if that fits the mold above natural selection, okay? First off, it's existed a lot longer than natural selection. And it seems to be ingrained naturally in the system of the human being. And that is seen across the board to the point where atheists were convinced that if we could find an island unaffected by the Christian belief system, that eventually we would find a culture that never developed this idea of God. And after scouring all of the tribes that have been isolated from all Christian influences, every single one of them across the board had a divine deity. All of them. Every culture throughout all time. So we know that definitively, whether you want to choose the natural selective process and say that the evolution putting in us the need to create a God is part of this process, that's cool. We can agree that it's across the board, every culture in every single place and time. The only way that we have atheists are because first we had theists. Atheists are a natural byproduct of theism. Eventually you will have somebody that disagrees with something, and therefore they will create a group of that disagreement, and that group's called atheism. But theism is the natural state. Now let's work through history. Since we're talking about probability, and we're talking about how can we know. So let's make an assumption that will put aside the natural selective process that denies, and will choose the divine aspects and see if that fits logical molds. Okay? Throughout all of history, God that exists in every culture, in every single state, and everywhere across the board, every single human being. God. Okay? Now, let's look at what is the most prevalent God in all of time and history. If we're looking at probability speaking, God would have to be powerful. Now, we haven't got to the extent of all powerful yet. I'm just saying that there must be a power. Atheists can agree with that, and theists can agree with that. But within the divine deity pathway, God has to have a power. So what God would be the most powerful throughout all time and space and history that had the most impact on humankind, making himself known throughout all time, culture, and history? That would be definitively, I don't even have to say it, everybody in this video knows it, Christian God. Across the board, it has been around the longest, it's been the most prevalent, and it's been the most effective of making itself known to all cultures of all places at all times. Now, some people may push back that there are older gods, but they're all dead. None of them exist. We can know that Christianity is the most prevalent. Now, let's see if it matches the historical checks, okay? So first, some of the oldest religions would be predating Christianity. The Egyptian religions. Those would be the only contender for prevalent, meaning that they had a large impact and older, but they died off. No one actively practices the Egyptian theology anymore. It is not a contender. It is a contender in the sense of age, not a contender in the sense of persistent impact in society and culture. Now, the only other one is the Hebrew religion. Buddhist religion came around about 500 years before Jesus and when Buddha was alive, and then it took about 1,000 years before we have our modern day copy of what Buddha said. Now, Buddha was alive. 500 years later, they wrote down a copy. We don't have that. Then 500 years after that, we have the current copy that we do have. So for that reason, it's about 1,000 years gap. And then we also know that within what has been written about Buddha, Buddha said, you cannot trust anything that's written down. Therefore, we don't have to trust what was written down because he said we don't have to trust it. Therefore, it's self-defeating. So we can know that God and his knowledge and foresight isn't going to be self-defeating. Saying something that you don't have to trust anything that was written down, and then all of our reliance is on the thing that was written down about him. Self-defeating. We don't need to worry about it. So, moving on to the next prevalent religion, we have the Hebrew religion, which stems off into three branches. You have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay, now we have to choose between these three. Well, Islam came the latest. It's only existed since 500 years after Jesus, so that's already a mark against it. And Islam directly conflicts itself with Judaism and Christianity. Within the Quran actually states that when Muhammad was challenged, how do we know what you're saying is true? He points to the Old Testament and the New Testament as which one of those as source material to validate everything that he says and to know whether the Quran is true. He says the Injil, which is the New Testament, and the Torah, which is the Old Testament, are his validating scripts so that we can know with certainty that he's speaking truth. Well, if the Old Testament and the New Testament conflict with the Quran, which universally is accepted among all Muslims, and Muhammad said the Old Testament and New Testament are his validating sources, we can exclude, again, contradiction as being a quality of God. Has to be eternally consistent. Now we're stuck with just two. Judaism, Christianity. Well, Judaism and Christianity both still exist, and they hold and share the same timeline. So which one is consistent? And I'm just going to cut straight to the chase. The Jews of the past are not the Jews of today. They acknowledged that in the creation of the Talmud. The Talmud acknowledged that they were at a difficulty that was destroying their faith. They were unable to practice the old covenant because God destroyed the temple. God took away their ability to practice the Old Testament, the old covenant. And the reason he did that is stated in the New Testament by Jesus, that the temple is now destroyed, and it was prophesied that it would be destroyed in the Old Testament as an assurance. A lot of wind, and I'm attached to a tree. There we go. Wind stopped. Okay. So, if the Jews rely on the Old Testament for their validity, and the practices in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, they say that they're still adhering to the Old Covenant, right? But the Old Covenant cannot be adhered to without a temple. God destroyed the temple 70 AD, which was about, I'm bad at math, 40 years after Jesus' death. So how can the Jews still be practicing their new stuff? Well, that's where the Talmud comes in. They establish a new doctrine, and they establish it because of what Jesus did. So again, we see a pivotal point throughout all of history and time that everything seems to be circling around God of the Bible, and then when we come in, narrow it down between those three religions, again, Jesus of the Bible. And then when we come down and we look at what did Jesus actually do? Well, he fulfilled all of the promises of the coming of the Messiah from the Old Testament that all of the Jews were looking for. And then he fulfilled it within the time period that the prophecies demanded, which was the 400 years of waiting, followed by the collapse of the temple, so that we know definitively that there is no longer any waiting. So now we can see definitively that Jesus is the only option. Now, you can have branches out from Jesus. We won't get into a theological discussion of the branches of which ones of those are true, but we can definitively say that the God of the Bible is the most prevalent throughout of all of history, has made the most impact, has been eternally consistent, and has made itself known throughout all time in history, linking itself and being a center pivot point around Jesus. If any of you want to know more, there's about a good, I think it's a 10-hour audiobook by J. Warner Wallace about how Jesus is at the center of all of things throughout all of history and all of time. Now, if you want to ask yourself how God would make himself known, I would challenge that he would make himself known in a way that all history and all throughout time and space, that there's absolutely no denying of who's the most impactful, most powerful, and most prevalent God throughout all of human history. And that would be God of the Bible, Jesus. So there are points of contention and argument within that. I totally admit to that. Those are separate videos. Those are separate discussions in time. This is for the sake of brevity and brief summary, that we can know definitively what God is, the God. Thank you guys so much for your time. Hopefully in the next video, I will then elaborate on who is Jesus. And then if you guys have any other questions, like why does evil exist? Is God good? Stuff like that. We can address those in other long form videos. And eventually I do want to put all of this into one concise video, but that video would be very, very long. Thank you guys so much for your time and your patience. Thank you for joining me on this beautiful day. Have a nice day.